Hi, friends. Thanks so much for joining us tonight as we continue this semester's series of our Integritas Forums. These interview-style conversations, which will occur once a month throughout the academic year, are intended to provide you, our Sorin Fellows, opportunities to hear from and engage with successful professionals from a wide range of sectors: business, medicine, architecture, law, engineering, about their experiences and reflections on maintaining personal and ethical integrity across their professional, familial, and faith lives. These conversations will range from considerations on work-life balance, growing in the faith after college, vocational discernment in family life, and practical insight into professional development. The inspiration for this recurring event is twofold. First, in all that we do through the Sorin Fellows program, we seek to elevate the relational character of your formation and resist the reductively transactional paradigm so characteristic of modern university education. These conversations are intended to allow you to get to know and learn from someone, rather than learn something or some abstract set of ideas apart from personal narrative. And as you well know, the De Nicola Center is proudly a scholarly center at a research university. But we also recognize and embrace that the majority of students we engage through the Sorin Fellows program will not necessarily have careers bound to academia or the university, but rather will be scattered across a variety of public and private enterprises, whether through finance, medicine, research, law, policy, engineering, or the like. Many of you will also be moms or dads, husbands or wives, good friends and counselors, community leaders, clergy, or religious. In the relational spirit of the center, we hope these conversations provide you opportunities to glean practical advice and enduring insights from persons who display virtues of truly integral formation, whether they work in the field you hope to enter, have a similar vocational path, or not. Now, of course, under normal circumstances, these conversations would best take place in person over LaCroix and Rocco's Pizza, which we plan on moving forward once our shared life together regains some normalcy. But in the interim, we will host these online, which will allow you to access and revisit this content at your own leisure, whether in your dorm room or on a walk around the lakes. The format of these conversations will be as follows. I'll interview our guest for about 20 to 30 minutes, covering topics from professional advice to personal discernment and everything in between. Then we'll be joined live by our guest so he or she can field questions from Sorin Fellows that arose out of that conversation, and that'll run for about 20 minutes or so. With that said, it's my pleasure to briefly introduce our guest. Carolyn Cole is a licensed architect in Indiana and currently works for Duncan G. Stroik Architect in South Bend, a firm that specializes in classical and ecclesiastical architecture. In her work, Carolyn has overseen several significant architectural projects, both classical and ecclesiastical, including the completion of the Christ Chapel at Hillsdale College in Michigan and the Chapel of the Holy Cross at Jesuit High School in Tampa, Florida. She is likewise currently managing the renovation of the Catholic Cathedral in Kalamazoo, Michigan, for which its Phase 1 will be completed at the end of this calendar year. Carolyn also serves as the managing editor of Sacred Architecture Journal, a publication of the Institute for Sacred Architecture and the leading journal dedicated to a renewal of beauty in contemporary church design. A domer, Carolyn graduated from the University of Notre Dame in 2012 with a bachelor's in architecture and a minor in theology. As a reminder, Carolyn will join us for a live Q&A after the conversation, so stick around. Well, Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us tonight and taking a little bit of time out of your day to share with us a little bit about your story. So glad you're with us.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So, Carolyn, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where you did undergrad, kind of where you are now, and what's your day job?
Yeah, I grew up in St. Louis. I'm the fifth of 7 kids, Catholic family. So I went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, and then I did my undergrad at Notre Dame and studied architecture with a minor in theology. And now I live here in South Bend still, and I work for Duncan Stroik Architect, which is a firm that does mostly churches, mostly Catholic churches, and traditional and classical architecture.
Awesome. Yeah, the Stroik name is well known here in South Bend and across Catholic circles. So it's so cool to see someone who's kind of come through the pipeline of ND architecture and also with that theological background to then end up contributing to his work, which is really just amazing. So you're a domer. We were classmates, sort of. You stayed for one extra year to get the architecture program, and it's great. This goes way back. one of the questions I love to ask our Sorin Fellows is like, look, if you're getting into Notre Dame, St. Mary's College, or Holy Cross College, like, you likely have a lot of options for undergrad, right? Maybe some of them are more financially competitive. Maybe some of them have better professional programs that allow you to kind of transition into the work world a little bit more seamlessly. So like, why does someone choose to come to ND? So kind of like, as you think about your experience, what were some things that kind of were on your mind that kind of moved the needle toward ND? And as you look back as a grad, how have those been validated in some sense as a professional now?
Yeah, well, when I was looking at colleges, I knew that I wanted to study architecture, and I also wanted to go to a Catholic school. And Notre Dame is one of the few Catholic schools with an architecture program. There's also Catholic University in America, so I looked at that one. And now Benedictine College in Atchison has a good program. But when I was looking, I visited Notre Dame. I really loved the campus. I loved the style of architecture, the people that I met in the program. And Notre Dame is unique because it's a classical architecture program rather than modern, which is what most architecture schools are. I didn't really understand that distinction coming in. That was one of the things that I really grew to appreciate while I was here. So really it was the Catholic school plus the architecture program together that were what my decision was based on.
Now, did you kind of have in mind as like an incoming freshman in some sense, like given the Catholic background, given the interest in architecture, that you knew you wanted to get into some application of like sacred architecture within the Christian or Catholic tradition, or is that something that kind of evolved over the course of your study?
That definitely evolved. I didn't know that they could be combined in the way that I know now in sacred architecture. In fact, I thought that there were things that I had to choose between. I thought I can either be an architecture major or a theology major. And I wasn't quite sure the first couple of years. Actually, I considered switching to theology my sophomore year because
come to the dark side. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was taking a few theology electives, and then my theology major friends were taking all these awesome classes that I didn't have room in my schedule for. So I thought about it, and ultimately I decided not to. I think because I realized I could take a few theology classes, do some reading, kind of gain what I could on my own. With architecture, it's kind of all or nothing. Either I was in the program or not. You can't do like electives here and there. Yeah. So decided to stick with architecture. But then in a couple of years, like after studying in Rome for the year and just being surrounded by the beauty of all of the churches that are in Rome, like every corner, more than you could ever visit. And then I think that planted some seeds of the idea of bringing together architecture and theology. And then fourth year, after getting back from Rome, we had a theology class together with Dr. Fagerberg on liturgical theology. And a big part of that class was thinking about the material world in like sacramental terms, how the liturgy is the proper ordering of the cosmos, and all the material stuff of the world is used in this spiritual way to communicate grace through the sacraments. So all of that kind of helped solidify in my mind the idea that architecture could be something that is ennobling. It's a participation in the sacramental order as you are like shaping the material world in any type of architecture, and then most especially in sacred architecture, and then all of the theology that goes into that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great thought. I think that's one of the really kind of profound realizations that someone who's in like a professional discipline at Notre Dame can have, who's kind of attentive to the integration of the faith within their work and their development, is, this isn't something that kind of, they don't run in parallel lines necessarily. Like there's the architecture track and then there's the theology track. I mean, there is architecture proper and you have the standards of your own discipline and profession, but there's a way by which you can integrate those two together. And I think that's equally present perhaps for engineers or those in pre-med, where you can begin to understand what your professional interests are in an integrated way with what your kind of core faith beliefs actually are. And I think that's something that's kind of uniquely provided at Notre Dame because of how kind of well-resourced the school is and how intentional it is about the faith. So that's awesome. Yeah, and that was a stellar class. It was so good. Wish every Sorin Fellow could take it, but alas, here we are. So another question I like to ask young alums, maybe 5 to 10 years out, which we're in that kind of frame. Yeah, don't remind me. Is like, when you look back, what do you wish you spent kind of more time doing, or something that you were really glad that you did that, you can only kind of see in retrospect and you weren't able to see it or realize it necessarily on the ground in your day-to-day, something that you might encourage our fellows to think about and maybe be a little bit more intentional about as you kind of look back at it in retrospect?
Yeah, well, this isn't necessarily something day-to-day, but all the opportunities to travel are something that I really am grateful for now, starting with that year abroad in Rome. That's part of the architecture program. I know not possible this year, so that's disappointing for everyone. But being actually in a city that's filled with all of these great examples of architecture and history, and just being able to walk around the streets and to be present to all of that was very formative. And then as part of that theology class, we got to go to the Holy Land together with a few of our classmates and with Dr. Fagerberg. And that was a really incredibly formative faith experience, to be in Jerusalem and the Holy Land and all the places where Jesus was. And then I also got to go to Poland my 5th year, right before my thesis, over winter break. Had a grant to do that, to visit some of the places where John Paul II had lived. And then my thesis project was designing a church dedicated to John Paul II, because he had been beatified a year before. And so I would just encourage students to take those opportunities to travel, because this is one of the probably best opportunities that you'll have for that in terms of time and financially.
Totally.
And it's something that stays with you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna second that. And we didn't agree to that answer before this conversation. I had no idea that was coming, but just kind of speaking from my experience, one, it's, as readily accessible as travel will be probably at any point during your life. And, Notre Dame's intentionality and even the center's intentionality about bringing students to places that really underscore the spiritual heritage of the church, where, not only are you able to walk in the same footsteps of God incarnate, but you're able to kind of walk through the streets in Rome or in more kind of modern contexts in Poland and going to Czestochowa and whatnot. It's a way that I think Notre Dame is very well resourced. We all realize that, and we have opportunities here that a lot of undergraduate students at other institutions don't have. But what is kind of really distinguishing about it is kind of the intentionality with which those trips aren't necessarily like globetrotting. It's not like vacation. It's more of a sense of pilgrimage and an ability to kind of internalize this kind of spiritual and sacramental heritage of the church and of the faith in such a way that kind of you begin to kind of realize, wow, my interior disposition and my interior life is deeply intertwined with my intellectual interests and goals, my professional goals, my social values. And that's one thing that I think, you were able to bounce around 3 different places. I was just glad to be able to go to the Holy Land. I wouldn't trade for anything. But that's, I think, one of the fruits long-term that I see as well is gosh, it's not just simply the fact of being able to say, I got to go to Poland, or I got to go to the Holy Land or Rome or whatever. It's I had the opportunities to realize that the cultivation of my interior life proximate to these very holy sites affects who I am in the most fundamental sense. And that kind of speaks, I think, to a kind of Catholic character. That is, we are totally on the same page, friend. So transitioning a bit, and speaking of transitions, I think one of the things that kind of got me nervous as I was a junior or a senior, and even after I graduated, was gosh, what does it look like to transition out of in some sense, Catholic Disneyland here at ND, right, to real life or work life, and that can be intimidating. And sometimes our worst fears lie in anticipation, and they don't necessarily accurately reflect the reality that we enter. But I'd be curious. I mean, you were in undergrad for 5 years because of your program, and then you transitioned into work life. Kind of, what did that look like? Maybe what were some of the challenges? What are the things that maybe some students should anticipate that maybe might not be immediately on top of mind for them?
Yeah, for me, it was a relatively easy transition, all things considered, because I stayed in South Bend, and I had been interning in the office starting the summer before my 5th year of school, and then also a couple days a week during that whole year. So I knew my coworkers. I was already familiar with the office. So I think the hardest part was the fact that so many of my friends were not there anymore. The people that I was used to having around were not there. That started 5th year because all of my non-architecture friends graduated, went off to do other things. But the architecture people were still around. And then after 5th year, those friends left also. And there were a handful of people still around who had stayed for grad programs. So I had people that I already knew to live with. So that also helped with the transition. But I think I realized that I needed to invest or to work at finding new community, because what I was used to just wasn't there anymore. So a few of the good things that happened were someone invited me to teach a religious ed class at St. Matt's Parish. And so I started doing that, junior high girls confirmation prep. And that really helped with feeling involved in the parish and getting to know families outside of the Notre Dame world that I had been a part of for 5 years. And then there's a pretty strong young adults diocesan group presence in South Bend. So I would go to those events and, not knowing a whole lot of people, but just show up and try to meet people through that. And then eventually people that I met through there started a women's Bible study. And I was kind of in the right place at the right time to get invited into that. Started going to that, even though I didn't know people that well at first. And then over the years, that really blossomed into a really close group of friends. And then I guess the third thing was getting involved with the Catholic Worker, because one of the friends that I had known in undergrad, Laura Beverly, she was on staff at the Catholic Worker starting right after she graduated the year before. So to see her, I would go there for dinner, for First Friday Mass and things like that, and got to know more of the people there. And also sort of coincidentally, got invited to be part of a musical. The Catholic Worker staff decided to put on the production of Les Miserables in the spring because the movie had just come out. And anyway, so that was kind of my introduction into the Catholic Worker community.
Yeah.
But all of those, oh, go ahead.
No, you're totally good. I was just going to say that, I mean, it speaks so much to like the kind of difficulty of the transition, especially from a Catholic point of view to me, and even in my experience, is like, how do you begin to own your faith through traditional like parish life to that of just drinking out of the well of your dorm life or the basilica and things like that. And so it's like kind of a network of cause and effect where, if you invest at least at an initial point, that can kind of multiply, over the course of several months or years into different friends and kind of networks. Yeah.
That was definitely my experience. That it was hard that first year because I didn't feel like anything was, it like took a little while to really take root and like grow into anything. But I kind of knew that I was at least trying to lay the foundations, and then it did grow. Yeah.
No, that is really resonant with my experience too, because by like senior year, right, whether you're a 4th year or a 5th year, you're kind of like established in your friendships. You're kind of like very comfortable in your own skin, very comfortable on campus, when mass is at place X, Y, or Z, or, things to do or people to be with. and then that's kind of taken out from under you, and you become kind of a freshman again, but a freshman in the world, right? And you're just like, what am I going to do? And failure is often a part of that, and I think there are difficult moments of kind of feelings of like loneliness or isolation that you're like, man, but I thought I had this figured out in college, but that's kind of taken out from under you. But it is kind of fighting through those difficult moments where it is a little bit uncomfortable, and recognizing that the amount that you invest will pay off, even if it's not an immediate kind of return. And that's hard because you get out of undergrad and you're ready to kind of rock and roll. So no, absolutely, that's a great witness. And the Catholic worker here in South Bend is just incredible. And the people that come in and out of it and who remain there are just saints. So
absolutely
awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I want to kind of transition again and kind of begin to ask you a little bit about your work, like your professional life. It's not every day that someone meets a Catholic architect, and it speaks to what we kind of discussed earlier about like, oh gosh, okay, so I thought it was either architecture or theology, but you're living an integration of that. So like, what is like a typical day in your life look like as someone who works at Stroik Architecture, or is one day the same as another, or are they all completely different?
Well, one thing that I like about architecture is there's a lot of variety. Even within one project, it goes through many phases. So you start with the initial ideas, and there's a lot of exciting like design work and creativity that goes into that first stage of design, and talking with the client and hearing all of their ideas and their vision, and then working together to develop it. And that's the part where it usually stops during school. You do your creative first designs of everything, and then you hang it up on the wall, and that's it. But then in professional life, then you take it to the next stage, and you do all of the construction drawings for the building. You keep developing all the details, figuring out every little part of it. And one unique thing about our office is that we still draw by hand through the entire project.
Wow.
And so we get to have that kind of craft and the art of architecture incorporated into our work. And then during construction, while it's actually built, we oversee that. So we'll visit every couple weeks and see how the construction is going, and if it's problem solving things that weren't quite worked out, or there's always stuff to work out. And so to see a project go through that entire spectrum from start to finish, and then to be there like in the finished building, is the most rewarding part of the job. One of my favorite projects was a chapel that we did for a Jesuit high school. You'll appreciate that, in Tampa, Florida. And I think it was the first new building that I was there for the whole thing. So I remember when the president first visited the office, and we were talking to him, and then did all the design drawings. And then after 4 years, I got to be there for the dedication. And that was really special because the altar is blessed, the walls of the church are blessed. It's kind of like a baptism for a building. And it's like all of the work that we put in for years and years was like being like offered up with that. So that was a really rewarding moment. That's so anyway, awesome. So on any given day, we're doing some work in some stage of that project, and then we have multiple projects going on at once. So we're kind of bouncing back and forth between those two. Some are smaller renovations, some are new buildings. There's also kind of the marketing and the admin side of everything. And since we're a small office, we do a little bit of everything. Oh, we publish a magazine too called Sacred Architecture.
That's creative. So, that's great. No, that's a fascinating distinction that you make, though. The difference between like where a project stops in undergrad and you put it on the wall, and it looks nice and straight. To that of the actual kind of slog of the project, and kind of like a quality assurance measure of like, this is actually going to happen, that this isn't a theoretical project, that this isn't just simply an intellectual exercise. But this requires physical materials. This requires kind of attentiveness on behalf of those who designed it. And it's like, you kind of double down on that in some sense, because you're like, this place is also going to be used for worship, friends. This isn't just going to necessarily be an office building where there are like drawers for file folders and things like that. Like this is going to be a blessed space. And so I see that as kind of such an important distinction in a way that kind of deepens kind of a Catholic approach to architecture, especially when you're doing sacred architectures, that like these are sacramentals, these are kind of outward signs of inward graces, right? That's my theology background, right? That's basically all I know. But it just kind of gives it so much more substance and makes it so much more real than just where the project stops in undergrad as a proof of concept that you can come up with something theoretically, which is just fascinating to me.
And we come up with the ideas and we draw them, and then we get to work with a lot of really talented craftsmen, artists, builders who actually make it into that reality. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is very much a collaborative effort. It seems. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think of churches that I've walked into, and I'm just like, wow, how much of this is like poured concrete? How much of this is marble? How much of this is X, Y, or Z? And so to kind of work backwards, and that kind of is, they are all constitutive parts to your design. And then, you rely on other people's expertise in order to kind of actualize it. It's a significant undertaking. I kind of compare it to like later this semester, we'll talk to a doctor, and it's kind of like, somewhat analogous, I guess, to like a kind of process of like surgery or care. It's like everyone has their particular role within the process, and it takes each person to kind of be pretty intentional and pretty devoted to their particular component of the process in order for the operation to be a success. No pun intended. Actually, it's totally intended. So that's a fascinating way to look at architecture.
And I think the analogy with the doctors works well too, because they're caring for people's bodies, and people, of course, are body soul composites. So churches, the church has also a physical and spiritual component. So you have like the soul of the church is the people. We are the church. And then the material aspect of the church is the physical buildings. So those are important too.
We got to hire you in the architecture school. If you have time, probably not. So we touched on this earlier, and you were very gracious in kind of offering a sketch as to kind of the ways in which tapping into a young Catholic community out of college was really helpful for you to begin to kind of own your faith, certainly, but also just kind of grow in it, not just simply like have control over it, but actually kind of to be embedded within it. I'm frequently say to Sorin Fellows, like, human persons are social creatures and we flourish in the context of communities, right? And so the isolation that one experiences perhaps after they graduate and enter the real world those are difficult moments that are kind of that push up against our conceptions of the faith, of what it is to be fully alive. With an eye toward kind of differentiating between like, I don't know, being spoon-fed Catholicism at ND and really wanting to own it and kind of live through it off campus and in the real world. Could you touch on kind of the role that like the parish that you've been engaged with has kind of helped you transition from like a Notre Dame Catholicism, if you're going to allow me to use that phrase, to like a real world Catholicism?
Yeah, I think that not only joining a parish and being a regular member of the parish, that's like really good in itself. But then for me, the additional component was jumping into teaching religious ed right away. And I felt, well, it meant that I had to stick to this commitment. Until I committed to doing that, I wasn't sure like which parish I was going to join. I think I had like bounced around all over during that summer of like different parish every weekend, since there are
easy to do in South Bend.
So many wonderful churches in South Bend. But then once I had this commitment that I was going to show up every Sunday morning and teach about the sacraments or salvation history or whatever to junior high girls on Sunday mornings, then I felt a lot more just like engagement with the parish, and I got to know a lot of the families. And so then when I would go to Mass, even outside of that, I would see people that I knew. That helped a lot. And and also it was a good way for me to have to kind of keep in the world of learning and teaching. So I was always like reviewing the material that I was going to teach, and that was helpful for me to have to have that kind of weekly little insert into just a little bit of theology.
Totally. Yeah, no, that's I think a really good point about parish life and kind of having a sense of responsibility to it, where you aren't like a consumer of a parish, which even like I can fall into that, where it's like, well, my parish is what gives me the sacraments or gives me this or that or whatever. But making a kind of commitment in parish life, and I think especially as someone navigates postgraduate life, it kind of ties you, or it kind of like tethers you a little bit in a sense of responsibility to that community, where it's not just simply you are someone who consumes, the work or the benefits of being associated with the parish, if that's a really crass way of talking about the sacraments, but like you contribute something to it, and you contribute something to it more than just showing up on Sunday and making the church look full, and that kind of builds a kind of more reciprocal relationship of self-gift. These are kind of fancy theological phrases or whatever, but that's a really, I think, a really interesting and good kind of key point that I actually hadn't totally thought about before, is how do you invest yourself in a parish in such a way that you feel responsible to contribute to it, and that you aren't just the beneficiary of its services or whatever. So,
although I think that investing more meant that I also received more, because I felt more connected through the people that I got to know through that program.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, I like what you said about self-gift, because as a single person, especially right out of school, I think for me it was important to find ways to keep practicing self-gift, because then you're kind of prepared for whatever vocation comes along later in life, or even being single long term. There's still that posture of self-gift, which is important for any Christian.
No, absolutely. That's a great point. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm going to close it up with a couple last questions here, and you've been very generous, so thank you. So directly related to becoming an architect, like what advice do you have for a Catholic interested in pursuing a career like your own? So I guess this could be kind of broken up into two parts. One could be, what advice would you have to anyone who wants to get into sacred architecture, I guess? And another one would be like, what advice would you have to someone who, is Catholic and wants to get into architecture, but maybe not necessarily sacred architecture? And maybe the advice is the same for both. But what would you kind of share with them as you kind of think about your experience?
I think the starting point for both would be the same, which is just focus on being a good architect and learning the skill and the field of architecture well. And I think that learning classical architecture at Notre Dame was an important foundation for that, for kind of shaping how I see architecture just on a natural level. Because I guess you could say, like, in philosophy, there's natural law, and there's the idea of the common good, and that there are objective things that are true, good, and beautiful. And so in the architecture world, there's the idea that there is a way to build that is ennobling to the human person, that's designed well, that's beautiful, that's durable and long lasting. And like, these are the things that we should be aiming for. So first, focus on being able to do good architecture on that natural level. And then as a Catholic architect, or as someone who is doing sacred architecture, then that kind of gets raised to the next, to a higher level, and becomes sacred or set apart through its purpose of being used as a church. So let's see, specifically like being a Catholic artist or architect, I would say it's more important to be a good architect, and then the faith part is it kind of just adds to it. But if there were like a church, they were going to hire an architect, and they're deciding between two architects. One is a really talented architect, but not a practicing Catholic. And the other is a faithful Catholic, but just an okay architect. I would say the better choice is to pick the good architect, because then you get a better building, like the long term affects the community. But the ideal would be if the best architect is also the faithful Catholic.
Yeah.
So for people who are faithful Catholics, it's important to then try to excel in your field, not for the purpose of like pride or just wanting the honor, but for the sake of doing the best work in the world.
That's no, it totally does. And what's coming back for me is the analogy to someone in the medical profession, right? It's like, and analogical language only goes so far; it has its limitations. But I think about kind of when you want to care for your body, right? It'd be great if your doctor kind of held the same kind of core faith beliefs that you did, or that you do. So there's just that kind of understanding. But I'm not going to a doctor as faithful as he or she is if they aren't a good doctor, And so, but the beauty of it is kind of a capacity to integrate, and it gets back to what we were saying at the very beginning. It's that these aren't necessarily separate siloed tracks, right? Where it's like there's medicine and there's theology. Yes, there is good medicine, there is good architecture, and there is kind of good faith. But there's a way to kind of weave those without doing Catholic medicine and without doing Catholic architecture necessarily, that kind of makes your product even more excellent in some way, because it gives it a kind of depth that just simply professional excellence can't necessarily achieve on its own merit.
And you have to have some understanding either way of the faith in order to design a good church or to paint a beautiful image of a scripture scene or something like that. The best artists in the Renaissance they all knew the faith, even if they didn't always live it morally. They at least knew it.
That's all of us, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly. Awesome.
Yeah.
So what is something, so again, this kind of gets back at another question that I asked earlier, about kind of things that you look back at like, I'm really glad I did that, or man, I wish I did more of that, or committed myself more fully to that. What's something that an undergrad right now can do that is like simple, but like it pays off disproportionate to the investment right now? So if you just do it, it's gonna pay off in the long run, whether that's like a spiritual discipline or habit, or a kind of a social habit, intellectual habit, even like a way in thinking about professional development or discernment, things like that.
Well, I developed a habit of daily mass during my time at Notre Dame. I hadn't done that before, but starting pretty much freshman year, I just decided that I wanted to do that, and that formed the groundwork for continuing that after. So commitment to regular practices of prayer, definitely, and then just investing in friendships while you're there. I've found it's amazing how special those friendships are still now, with the people that I knew at Notre Dame, both in architecture and not, and even with the people that I don't see regularly or keep in touch with regularly. It's a very special thing to look back and to have had all of these experiences together on campus.
Yeah, totally. One of the things that I kind of pitched to Sorin Fellows and pitched to myself, I need to remind myself of it, is that like Notre Dame is a great training ground when you're in the friendly confines of campus, and it's comfortable in some sense to be Catholic and to be active and intentional about your faith. It's like now is the time to develop habits of like thinking, acting, and praying, such that when you leave the friendly confines of Notre Dame, St. Mary's Holy Cross, you have the muscle memory, so to speak. Like I liken it to like shooting 100 free throws each day, such that when there's 1 second left on the clock and you're down by 1 and the crowd is going crazy, right, and like trying to make you miss, your muscle memory takes over and you're able to accomplish the task or the goal at hand, despite the kind of circumstances that you find yourself. I think there's some analogy to be drawn with being a very intentional and present Catholic in contemporary culture, right? That the current is not going to be going with you necessarily. And so the ability to build habits of thought and practice, I mean, this is basically McIntyrean virtue ethics, right? Where it's like, the more you practice something, the better you're going to be at it. You can't read a manual about it and then instantly you're good at it. It's more of a matter of like developing habits of thinking, acting, praying, right? And that's kind of patronizing because it's like, of course that's the case, but it's sometimes hard to do because you have so many other commitments. But the long-term benefits in your ability to kind of navigate post-college life and live a kind of a virtuous Catholic life are really like not to be understated at all. So yeah, daily prayer, daily mass, and like an investment in people. It's like, you know, I didn't think that, you know, my wife Beth and I would be able to have you and a couple of friends over for dinner, you know, a few weeks ago, and we talk about undergrad, and we also kind of talk about our journeys afterward and the ways in which we've been able to kind of even deepen those friendships. I mean, these are great gifts that need to be kind of stewarded and cherished. And I think those habits of thinking, acting, praying help kind of undergird that, buttress it for architecture language.
Exactly.
Look at that.
And when you're in the moment and all you can see is the hours and hours of work ahead of you, it seems impossible, but it's always worth it. Also, I think it was important for me just to keep a sense of peace and sanity during college, just to be able to have friends, to have non-architecture friends to go and have a meal with. And
those late nights in Bond Hall, man, they're taxing, right?
I mean, they were, but at least I am grateful that the studio setup meant that we were never like isolated, working alone at a desk for hours and hours. It was like, you're always in it together, kind of sharing.
Absolutely. Solidarity, right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Bonding.
Awesome. So, Carolyn, last question, which is a bonus question. I'm going to spring it on you. You are someone who has been to our tailgates before.
Very good, yes.
We may or may not advertise a photo of you to kind of advertise our tailgates. So hypothetical, right? You're at a DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture tailgate, and you can crack open a LaCroix or alternative beverage with anyone who's ever lived. Who are you hydrating with and why?
Well, because we're talking about architecture, I'm going to say my grandpa, my mom's dad. So he was an electrical engineer, and I didn't know him. He died when I was about 1. But when I was coming to Notre Dame and I had my list of drafting supplies that I needed, my mom said, "Oh, I think Grandpa had some of these things." So I brought some of his stuff with me to college, and like using some of his pencils, and I think I had like his T-square. So I kind of had a little connection with him all along. And then last year, something really awesome happened. So to become a licensed architect, there's a series of 6 exams that you have to take after school. You can take them in whatever order you want and kind of on your own timeline. But once you take the first one, you have 5 years to finish the rest of them. So last summer, I realized, I have 2 more of these to take, and I only have like 9 months, so I better get on it. So I took 2 of them in June, and I passed 1 and I failed 1. So I had to retake it. So summer passed, and then in September, I was studying hard again, and I had decided that I wanted to take it before the end of September last year. But then when I went to sign up for the test, the first available day was October 10th. So I was like, okay, it's a little far away, but that's fine. So I took it on October 10th, and I passed. And that afternoon, I called my mom to tell her the exciting news, and she was happy, and she said, today's your grandpa's birthday. And I was just like blown away, because this was clearly like not a coincidence. I couldn't have planned it if I had tried, that I passed the last test on his birthday. And I think he was cheering me on all along.
Oh, that is,
even realize it.
that is providence if I've ever heard of it, man. Oh, that is awesome. That is awesome.
Looking forward to talking with him about that someday.
Absolutely. Well, if
heavenly tailgate.
yeah, exactly. I'm going to say if the DCEC tailgates are anything, it really is a foretaste, right? So
Absolutely.
awesome. Well, Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing about your story and your work. It's amazing and inspiring to me and to our students, and we'll look forward to discussing with you over a live Q&A some of the questions that have come up throughout our conversation. So thanks so much, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks, Carolyn, for joining us again.
All right, thanks. Great to be here.
Awesome. Well, we have about 10 minutes for questions, so I want to make sure I get to them. The first one is kind of a meta-level question, about church design and beauty and kind of some of the different opinions and kind of what happens within the church and how the church thinks about this. So could you kind of it is a little bit of a lightning rod topic at times for some. Can you kind of just explain for the lay people out there, why is that so? And what's the vision, say, for Stroik architecture and in your work with respect to its ecclesiastical projects and kind of how you find that and how your firm finds that to be rooted in the Catholic tradition?
Yeah, I think, well, it's a lightning rod in the same way that liturgy styles, music, all of that is a lightning rod because it's all different expressions of how we're thinking about the church. So you could say that architecture is kind of a built form of ecclesiology, whether or not it's consciously intended that way by the architect. It is an expression of what the liturgy is going to be like that's done inside this church. So, of course, people feel strongly about that, and so it is a lightning rod. But I think our approach, Duncan Stroik and the work that we do, is to always try to stay rooted in the tradition that goes back 2,000 years to early Christian times when the first basilicas were built in Rome, and the architecture that kind of developed over the years that was it was designed to not direct the liturgy, but to go along with the liturgy, to kind of tell you something about what you're doing. So the space is usually tall, so it lifts your mind up to the Lord. It's usually directed towards the sanctuary, so symbolically and literally there's some sort of a procession. And then there's a raised sanctuary because what's happening there is elevated. It's sort of the heavenly realm. And different styles developed from Roman times through Romanesque and Gothic and Renaissance and all that. But you can see how they're all related and there are similarities. So our architecture now tries to draw on those universal principles to be part of the tradition, also to be particular to wherever the project is, kind of regionally, culturally. And then one of my favorite parts is to make each church particular to the saint that it's dedicated to. So you have this whole iconography program that's particular to that specific church, but you can tell that it's part of the greater tradition.
Oh, so, that's awesome. Thank you. Well, no, that's actually super helpful for me. A lot of my own liturgical background is in the Eastern Christian tradition, which is, I think so reflective of what you said without necessarily being directly traced to those Roman sources. So, question coming in from Michael Birch, if you have time for
Hi, Michael.
one coming in hot. So this is a personal question for you, and I really like it. Do you have any interest in becoming a professor teaching this kind of stuff, and or starting your own firm in time?
Well, one thing that I enjoy doing at the office now is getting to help out with some of the preparation for some of Duncan Stroik's either presentations to a parish, or with his class. He teaches sacred architecture here at Notre Dame. And we also publish a magazine called Sacred Architecture, which Michael knows. And so I think it's a unique situation that we're in our office, that we get to have this other side that's kind of academic, theoretical, and I do enjoy that. I'm not sure if I would want to be a professor or start my own firm, but I'm really glad that I get to do what I am doing now.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. I would not put up a fight if you wanted to teach here. We could talk about that. Another question. Do you believe that classical architecture is superior to other forms of traditional architecture like Gothic for Catholic liturgy or churches, or does it fall kind of more in line with, or does your thought fall more in line with kind of the spirit of your first answer about it kind of being representative of particular kind of spaces and cultures?
Yeah, I think more of the second. Those styles are related and certainly not opposed to each other. They're expressing the same principles and the same truth and the same faith, and it's kind of up to individual preference, I think, whether you like the tall pointed arches of the Gothic or whether you like the more kind of ordered language of classicism. But both are good expressions.
Or the onion domes of, say, an Eastern Catholic
or
Church,
the onion
right?
domes.
Yeah,
then you get into like Eastern Europe. I was in Poland, and there's a nice melding of the boundaries between the two because they're influencing each other, and that's really cool to see how those sort of organic and local traditions can develop too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that reminds me that we were scheduled as a Sorin Fellows group to be able to go on a pilgrimage to Poland this fall break. Many months ago it was scheduled, and now that's not possible, and that's something that we ought to remain attentive to even amidst all the other devotionals there. Last question for you, and it's more of kind of like a more navigational type question, even for those maybe who are graduate students or young professionals, or even undergraduates now here in South Bend. So there's no lack of churches, beautiful Catholic churches in South Bend. For those who are like architecturally inclined or, might want a taste of South Bend's liturgical life, what are like maybe 2 or 3 churches that you might recommend people poke around at? And I do hope you say your own parish.
Yes. Well, actually, being here on campus at Notre Dame, you have a great start because the Basilica is one of the most beautiful churches around. So we have a high standard here, and then you'll be able to kind of relate everything else you see to that. And then, let's see, if you take the St. Joe River upriver a little bit over to Mishawaka, there are 2 churches right across the river from each other. And they actually are a nice pair that is an example of this kind of style getting along sort of thing, because on the south side you have St. Joseph Parish in Mishawaka, which is my parish, and it's Gothic, built in the late 1800s, about the same time as the Sacred Heart Basilica, using a similar brick, and Father Sorin donated one of the stained glass windows. So awesome. If you go in, you can look at the left transept window, or next to the transept. And then across the river on the north side is St. Monica's, which is a red brick, more Romanesque church. So it has a barrel vaulted interior and a baldacchino. I think it's I don't know, I've heard it's the only baldacchino in South Bend, and I think that's true. I can't think of another. Nice. But both are very beautiful, and both are really dynamic, good, active parishes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is no lack of really strong parish life here in South Bend. It actually is a great place to kind of put on training wheels after graduation if anyone were to stay here to do their master's in architecture or work at a firm or whatever, of kind of being engaged, as we talked about in our conversation, with parish life as kind of growing in the faith beyond kind of the spoon feeding of dorm life and of campus life too. So we'll always plug South Bend and St. Joe Mish.
Great place.
So, Awesome. Well, Carolyn, thank you so much for taking the time to have the conversation with me and for joining us for a live question and answer tonight. We'll look forward to engaging you again sometime, hopefully maybe at a tailgate in the next year or so. But until then, take care and God bless.
Okay. Thanks so much.
All right.
Bye.
Good night.